Hello and welcome. Everyone's talking about the Arab Street following the recent uprisings, but is there really such a thing? And if so, what exactly is it? There's been a long-held idea of the Arab world having a stereotypical social and cultural identity, often associated with violence, extremism, and a mistrust of democracy as a Western imposition. But as those recent uprisings across the Arab world have shown, these views are largely inaccurate. The overthrow of dictators in Tunisia and Egypt through peaceful demonstrations and the restraint of pro-democracy activists in the face of violence in Yemen and Bahrain have given the world a new image of the Middle East and North Africa. The new awakening, as many are calling it, has been driven by every strata of Arab society: Muslims and Christians, religious and secular, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, all united by their desire for government reform and democracy. So today we ask, what have the recent uprisings in the Middle East done to change Western perceptions of the Arab world? Remember, you can send us your questions through email or text messages. Joining me to discuss these issues are Dalia Mogahad, who's the Executive Director of the Abu Dhabi Gallup Center, an independent research group that collects and analyzes data representing the opinions of more than 1.2 billion Muslims worldwide. She's also the co-author of Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And here in the studio I have Hussein Ibish, Senior Research Fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine. He's the author of numerous publications on Arab and Muslim-related issues, and his latest essay, Under Western Lies, The Myth of the Arab Street, has been featured on the recent issue of Book Forum magazine. I welcome you both to the show.
Thanks, Riz. Great to be here.
Well, Hussein, I'd like to start with you, if I could, Dr. Ibish, I should say. Let's start by getting an idea of what the Arab Street means to you.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen it in action. We've seen what it really is. It is a kind of a metaphor for collective Arab public opinion. And obviously that encompasses a huge swathe of different opinions, different orientations, etc. But we've seen at least the urban Arab communities in Tunis, in Cairo, and elsewhere come together, putting differences aside in favor of accountability, good governance, democracy, and social consciousness. It's a kind of Arab nationalism, but not the old style Arab nationalism that was strident and sought to unite many countries, but rather one that emphasizes patriotism and fellow feeling. And this is very different than the Western stereotyped imagination of the hysterical, angry, violent, irrational religious mobs.
Right, that's what I wanted to get at. And I'll get on to the differences with the new Arab Street, as it might be called. But what is it that the Western mind thinks when it hears Arab Street compared with the Arab mind?
Well, traditionally, the Western conception has been of a mob, an irrational, violent, religiously fanatical mob bent on mayhem. And this is a very old set of ideas. It has medieval roots, as scholars like Edward Said, Norman Daniel, John Tolan, and others have shown. And I think it's carried through to the present day. There's been a great deal of propaganda, some of it from the Israeli right, some of it from other observers hostile to the Arab world, that have really painted the Arab public as a dangerous mass that needs to be feared and or controlled. And so, of course, Arab governments, autocratic Arab governments, have played on this and sort of promoted that idea as well, and claimed legitimacy and sort of said essentially to the West and to others, even to their own people, we are the bulwark between our stable rule and chaos. There's this howling mass that we're keeping at bay. And so I think this is the received wisdom. But I think in the Arab world, of course, the concept of the Arab Street has also been used by people with political agendas, both left nationalists in the past, Nasserites and others, who invoked the Arab Street as a group of very stridently nationalistic people who wanted to pursue their political agenda. And Islamists have done the same thing. What we've seen on the streets in Cairo and Tunisia is something very different. We've seen social consciousness, national consciousness, and coming across divides.
I'll get on to more of that in just a moment. Let me bring in Dalia Mogahad here and welcome you to the show, and ask if I could, to express your views on this through an email we got that came in from a viewer by the name of Abdullah Chirigui, who says, I do believe an Arab street exists like any other community. Street is equivalent to the marginalized and oppressed. This is a sociological phenomenon which is part of the natural dynamic side of any society. So let me ask you, listening to that, how do you regard that idea? The Arab street does exist, and is it a mob, or is it a sign of strength and unity?
The Arab street certainly does exist, but it bears no resemblance to the stereotypes that we might hear in some Western media. there is a collective majority view of a lot of things. Yes, of course, there's a great deal of diversity, but when you look at the region as a whole, there are some very strong trends. For example, democratic aspirations. We've been measuring public opinion in the Middle East and North Africa for several years, and what we find over and over is a hunger for better governance. Even before people took to the streets, they told us in our interviews that they wanted more democracy, that they wanted accountability of government, that they wanted freedom of speech. This is something that people in this region value and have been calling for many years.
Right, but let me get, Dr. Ibish, let me get to you, the idea that perhaps it's conflicts, those common conflicts the Arab nations have shared, that create this sense of an Arab street. And I wonder, you know, if you look back to Edward Said in 1978, his renowned book Orientalism, he talks about connecting the presumed authority to define a subject and the assumed authority to rule that subject. Does this kind of date the creation of the Arab street?
In a sense, in the Western, in terms of the Western imagination, absolutely. What Said was doing was playing off of the work of Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, who looked at the relationship between knowledge and power, and that's what he was describing. So if you claim the authority to define something, you've also assumed the authority to control it, and that's how he described Orientalism as working as a system of knowledge that produced power. And what has happened since the colonial, in the post-colonial era, in the past few decades or during the 20th century, in the Middle East, is that this control has been outsourced to authoritarian Arab regimes, many of them aligned with the West. And that's where the myth of the Arab street doubled up as both a concern for Western power in terms of stability and as a legitimating factor. And we've seen very recently Yemeni President Abdullah Ali Saleh saying, "Après moi le déluge," if I go, Yemen shatters into 100 pieces. And actually, in the case of Yemen, it's not a completely ridiculous idea. In the case of Libya, certainly, Gaddafi's refusal to go has created a civil war and a Western intervention with Arab approval. So obviously there's a sense in which Arab rulers have tried to cultivate the idea that there's an unrestrained, dangerous Arab mob out there. But what we've seen from the Arab peoples themselves is restraint, responsibility, and a real commitment to democracy, at least in terms of wanting elections. And it runs counter to every narrative. One thing, by the way, that the Orientalist myths that we're talking about would never have predicted is that the anti-Western sentiment has not come from the demonstrators, it's come from the governments. Mubarak basically accused Iran and Israel and the United States of being behind the uprising. Ali Abdullah Saleh has directly accused Israel and the United States of being behind the uprising. So anti-Western sentiment and even anti-Israel sentiment, in a very specific way, has come more from governments than from protesters, although the protesters, let us hasten to say, remain very committed, as all the Arabs are, to the Palestinian cause. Let's not let anybody say that just because Arabs are standing up for their rights as citizens, they don't care about Palestine. They certainly do.
Well, let me bring in Dalia Mogahad again here and just ask about how perhaps what we've seen in the Middle East, the uprisings and the demand for democracy, essentially on a peaceful footing, have done to change the myth of the Arab street in Western eyes, to try to perhaps humanize those in the Middle East, where they've been dehumanized through conflict and through perceptions of terrorism and extremism, and perhaps changed the view that the West has of what an Arab represents.
Riz, you make a very important point. We found at Gallup that more than 80% of the American public said that they sympathized with the protesters in Egypt. And that is really a remarkable number, because you know very well that the United States is a country right now that doesn't really agree on much. And for 80% of the American public to agree on anything is pretty revolutionary, let alone a positive sentiment when it comes to the Middle East. So there was an outpouring of sympathy and of respect for what was accomplished in Tunisia and in Egypt. But I think what is so ironic about that is how utterly irrelevant the West actually was to these protesters, that it almost seemed like just as Western respect became irrelevant or less important was just as was at the same point that it actually started to emerge, that these publics were thinking about their own domestic issues. They were building up their own societies. They were creating a whole microcosm of the society they dreamed of right there inside Tahrir Square, and no one did it to gain anyone else's approval from the outside. They did it for their own self-respect, and yet it was at that very moment that the other looked at them with respect, just as that respect became less important.
Now, Dalia, let me get a quick email to you before I get back to Dr. Ibish here. And this email came in from Cameron Peter in Cape Town in South Africa. And there, being in Dubai, I want to get your perspective also, being, in the Arab world, right in the heart of things there. Who speaks for the women in Islam, and what spaces exist to ensure that women can assert their rights on the many and diverse Arab streets that exist today?
This caller, or the one who wrote in, it raises a very good point. I just recently wrote a piece about the role of women in Sharq al-Awsat, and the point I make there is that women and men stood side by side in Tahrir and in Tunisia, fighting for the rights of all citizens. But unfortunately, we've seen that they aren't equally represented in the halls of power as of now. What we do find that is this: according to public opinion, both Egyptian and Tunisians, as well as people around the region, say that women and men should have equal rights. That public opinion, the majority of people, men and women, are on the side of women having equal access to decision making, but that has yet to be realized.
With a question here about the new Arab street, that people are saying this is the next step. Now, how do you see the new Arab street differing from the old Arab street, if there is that kind of difference?
I think there's a huge difference between the new and the old in many ways, but in some ways they're exactly the same. The way the new Arab street differs from the old is in its sense of empowerment, in its sense of confidence. Now it's the people deciding who will get legitimacy. It's the government gaining their legitimacy from the public, and not the other way around. It's a public that the West and Israel has to engage, has to reason with, rather than simply repress to get our policies to move forward in this region. So it's a new calculus that we have to deal with. The way the new Arab street is very similar to the old Arab street is the old Arab street had democratic aspirations, just as the new Arab street does. Those things haven't changed.
And Dr. Ibish, a lot of people forget. You want to add to this?
No, yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, what it means is that there'll be a healthy input of Arab public opinion into the conversation between the West and the Arabs, rather than Arab governments pointing to some mythological mob that is dangerous and has to be controlled. Instead, there'll be a much more nuanced and honest appraisal of what the publics want and need. And then, for example, just between Israel and the Palestinians, the Israelis constantly tell the Americans, well, our public will accept this and our public won't accept that. Palestinian public opinion is very, very rarely taken into consideration and very rarely given its due. And Palestinian leaders like President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad are not accorded the same kind of space that Prime Minister Netanyahu is vis-a-vis public opinion. But Arab public opinion, as it becomes empowered, becomes more clearly represented and more of an honest factor in the policy exchange and the political discussion.
Let me ask you a quick question, though, Dr. Ibish, about how religion is often pasted onto this. And it isn't about religion, really,
No.
but that tends to get mixed up into this.
Well, that's the most interesting thing about this. If you had told any of us who observe the Middle East closely, us 10 months ago or 12 months ago, that there would have been widespread uprisings in all these countries, popular grassroots movements, anti-government demonstrations, overthrow of Mubarak and Ben Ali and probably Gaddafi and who knows who else, and what would have been the ideological driving content, you would have asked us, we probably would have said, with some degree of reluctance, in my case, with a great heavy heart, probably would have had an Islamist character. It probably would have been largely religious. Nothing of the kind. These demonstrations have been ecumenical. They've been secular. As you pointed out, they've united Christians and Muslims, rich and poor, a range of social classes, urban and rural in some cases, although mainly it's an urban movement, and the devout and the skeptical as well. So everyone has come together. What has not brought people into the streets is the rhetoric of the Islamists. And what has brought them into the street is national consciousness, patriotism, social consciousness, and a foregrounding of their national identity. In Tunisia, the slogan was Tunis huwa al-hal, Tunisia is the solution, which is a rebuttal to the Muslim Brotherhood slogan Islam huwa al-hal. And certainly the sight of Egyptian Muslims and Christians praying together and foregrounding their Egyptian identity rather than their Muslim or Christian identity was very heartening. And it was the revival of something that people have thought, two things that people have thought was dead in the Arab world. One was patriotism based on social consciousness, and social consciousness based on citizenship.
Before I get back to Dubai, let me ask you, Dr. Ibish, is that universal across all these uprisings?
No.
Is it that, because Jordan, for
That's
example,
correct.
is considered to have its issues with religion, perhaps?
You're exactly right. It's not universal at all, and it depends how it goes. First of all, in Jordan, there is certainly an Islamist character to the anti-government demonstrations. In Bahrain, there's an increasingly sectarian and very troublingly sectarian character that's emerging to the conflict. It began sort of non-sectarian. It's become increasingly sectarian. And in other places, there are sectarian divisions. So certainly religious identity creeps in. But where you look at the really successful, dramatic uprisings, they've been patriotic and ecumenical and secular. But for sure, there are Islamist movements. They do have an appeal, and there are sectarian tensions, and they don't just go away because there's a sudden outpouring of patriotic, ecumenical, and secular protest.
Just to build on something that Dr. Ibish said in terms of the nature of these protests, I think there's a big difference between, say, Egypt and Jordan. In the case of Jordan, when we look at our research, there isn't the popular discontent in Jordan that there was in Egypt. Not even close. Egypt, on paper, when you look at our research, looked like Yemen, looked like Palestine in terms of people's sense of well-being. They were, their life satisfaction was very, very low for Egypt's relative GDP. And so it was truly a popular uprising, whereas in Jordan, these protests are actually parties coming out and protesting. It's a very different situation.
Okay.
The other thing I'd like to point out is when Iran came back and said, this is an Islamic revolution in Egypt, it was actually the Muslim Brotherhood that responded and said, no, this is a revolution of the Egyptian people. And I think that even underscores more that even the Islamists had to recognize that what was going on was much bigger than their ideology.
Yeah, they had to be careful.
Right, and this is interesting. It raises another point, Dr. Ibish, that the issue of Israel, I mean, it's a unifying agenda for the Arab world, and yet it's not an agenda that's come up in any of this.
Well, it has in a way, in the sense that when people have asked the protesters, what do you think, they reaffirm very strongly their commitment to the Palestinian cause, to ending the occupation that began in '67. Efforts by some of the Israeli right, of some of the neoconservatives in the United States, some other hardcore supporters of Israel, I emphasize some, to say that the fact that Arabs are willing to stand up for their rights as citizens means they don't actually care about Palestine. The whole Palestinian issue has been a red herring, is clearly wrong. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can care about your rights and the rights of your fellow Arabs who happen to be Palestinians, even if you are an Egyptian, etc.
But essentially, these uprisings, which arguing for democracy and for human rights and rights, freedom of expression, haven't really been hijacked by other agenda, have they?
No, they haven't, and it's interesting because, well, in a way, I think the wrong word, hijacked is not the right word. The two successful ones that are completed, more or less, or that are works in progress that we can really track carefully. Egypt and Tunisia. You had soft coups giving way to transitional periods led by militaries. So now what we have to see is what kind of political system emerges. How much power will the military in Tunisia and Egypt, especially in Egypt, really be willing to give up? What will they try to keep? And here's the thing, I want to bring this back to the question of Islamist parties. There is a religious right in the Arab world. There is in every society. Certainly in the United States and Israel there are. And there will be one in the Arab world, and they have a right to participate democratically. What we need to see, I think, is the development of constitutions that limit the power of government. Okay, so that anyone who's peaceful, who doesn't try to use arms, can be elected legitimately, and if they have a popular mandate they can govern, but there's a limitation to what they can do with that government, and strong protections for individual citizens, minorities and women, and all of this backed up by a neutral army. And that is probably the way we can incorporate very socially conservative Islamist parties into democratic Arab states in which there is no contradiction between having robust religious parties and well-functioning democracies at the same time.
Dalia Mogahad, I'd like to pick up on the idea of this, the issue of Israel with you as well, because I think your studies have shown that the majority of Arabs have no desire to reignite war with Israel. So why has this been very hard, this idea been very hard to penetrate the Israeli ideology?
Well, it's difficult to tell. I certainly can't speak for Israeli leaders, but you're absolutely right. People are focused on domestic development. Now, as Hussein said, this doesn't mean they don't care about the Palestinians. They certainly do. But it also doesn't mean that they are getting ready to ignite war with Israel. They want to focus on their own development and not start costly wars with their neighbors. This is an important point for the United States and for Israel to recognize, that they are right to suspect that business as usual will probably not continue, that there will be different questions being asked by, say, Egypt and other empowered Arab governments. But at the same time, we have no reason to think that conflict will be reignited.
Can I just jump in here and say, I mean, I think it really is true that there is a segment of the Israeli right, especially that which is committed to the settlement project and committed to maintaining the occupation, that exploits very cynically this notion of Israel being surrounded by a sea of hostile Arabs, and the idea that if there's a change of power in Egypt, then the treaty will go and everything, and that therefore the occupation is defensive and the settlements are forward defenses, and that any kind of serious territorial compromise and the agreement finally at long last to create a Palestinian state and have a reasonable peace is simply too dangerous, which is why they can't do it. And I think this is a cynical argument, and that behind it lies historical irredentist and religious fanatical commitment to a greater Israel. And this is one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of senior Israeli leaders in this right-wing government recognizing what Dalia has just explained and what I think is pretty obvious.
A very quick thought though, Dr. Ibish, just very quickly. Is there a utopian view on the Arab street that dismisses what might really happen next?
Absolutely.
Dictatorship coming back or violence?
Absolutely. In my book forum article, I said very clearly that while we should do away with the alarmist dystopian stereotype of the Arab street as a menacing, dangerous mass, we shouldn't rush to embrace a utopian or triumphalist one, which celebrates this as the great Arab Spring, the awakening, that's a done deal, that everything is fine. There are three key dangers ahead. One is military dictatorships, or militaries that won't give up power, and we'll see what happens in Egypt and Tunisia. Works in progress. The second is the emergence of failed states or disintegrated states. We see a threat of it in Libya and a threat of it in Yemen already. And the third is unrestrained parliamentary democracies in which majorities become tyrannous and start using the ballot box to oppress women, to oppress minorities, and to restrict individual rights in the name of Islam or some other kind of ideology. Those are the three great dangers, and so we need to be very worried about those. But so far, I would say optimism is appropriate, but caution is needed.
Well, Dr. Hussein Ibish and Dalia Mogahad, thank you both for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for being with us too. Now remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the show and post your questions and comments. On the next show, one of America's most provocative individuals, Cornel West, joins us to discuss diverse issues of race, civil liberties and his views on the leadership of US President Barack Obama. Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.